a style of beer which is somewhere between a mead and a beer. And what that basically means is it relies at least 50% on honey for the fermentable sugars which produce the alcohol in that beer. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our recipe and why we did what we did and how we did it in a bit. But the bigger story really, I suppose, is why... sorry,
the cabaret.
Yeah, I'm watching Richard kind of crawl underneath the camera. Richard approached us, having worked with 1 or 2 breweries relatively locally already, because we were located in this part of town, which is on the Oak Valley and has links to both Manchester's heritage but also to the natural environment. So, Richard, are you...
Pass it to John.
John is
Wild, basically, is a project that Richard and I started a few years ago. We're both beekeepers, and I put bees on the roof of Manchester Art Gallery, and Richard and Kay have bees in Harper Hay. So it was a meeting of minds, really. And we applied for funding from a funding body called Grow Wild, who were based in Kew Gardens, who were ultimately funded by the National Lottery. We had this idea of doing something collaborative with people across Manchester, and we had no other remit than that. We knew we wanted to produce something that sort of represented Manchester, and then we had this idea of beer. So, being beekeepers and knowing a network of people who are beekeepers and have apiaries, we got 10 local beekeepers together. We bought honey off them, and we first brewed a beer with wild marjoram with Red Willow Brewery in Macclesfield. And from then, it was very successful, it was lovely, and we thought, well, we can do something else, and we did something with blackjack, and this has ended up with us doing it here. But from here, we have this idea now of pulling beekeepers, gardeners, the pollinator-friendly city of Manchester all together to doing something a bit more Mancunian. So if anybody's got any ideas of how we can maybe grow collaboratively, whether there could be a brewing allotment, whether we could have a pop-up beer festival, a trailer to take Manchester beer on tour, any kind of madcap ideas from anybody. We're sort of looking to work with people. So I just want to say thank you very much to Mark and the brewery, because the Braggot is absolutely fantastic. And I'd just like to say thank you to Richard and Kay for organising as well.
Okay. I must make sure you get a pack of seeds to take away, because that helps next year's bees. Next year's bees will produce honey, which you'll eventually end up drinking. So it's a kind of big circle life thingy going on there. But the basic principle, John, we're kind of beekeepers on a mission. Like every beekeeper, there's Jack here, Jane, remember that, other beekeepers here. If you become a beekeeper, which you should, you start to see the world slightly different. You start to see it through the eyes of a bee. And then you start to realise, actually, without bees and good soil, humans, well, our time's limited. There's a bigger picture here, which is in 30 years' time, most of the world's population will live in cities, will be urbanised. And we think by benchmarking things, by being pollinator friendly, we will make, it's one of those ways to make cities more inhabitable, make cities become part of an ecosystem. So part of our secret plan is beer. And, so basically that's what we're about, really. We've no idea where we're going next. No. We might find another brewery and go, here's some honey, what can you do with it? But I think in Manchester particularly now, the issue around bees, and we have an artist here who's produced the book, Bee Quest. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's been a very unifying thing, and it's something to celebrate. You know, in terms of the bee, I think it's going to go in all sorts of different ways that we haven't even thought about yet. But it's a good way of doing things. You know, bees tend to getting on with doing things. They're pretty more organised than we are most of the time. So that's our kind of inspiration behind it, as well as we like drinking beer. What more can you say? Yeah. Drink beer, save the planet, save the bees.
of beverage, which I guess, I wouldn't like to say when it was kind of first invented, but as I mentioned earlier, it's some way between a beer and a mead. Mead is a alcoholic beverage, which I think, Jack, you make.
Yes.
So if anyone's interested in trying mead, have a chat with Jack afterwards. Here's a personal supply. Probably quite dangerous, I imagine. Which is basically fermented honey. That's what mead basically is. If you go down to Cornwall, my other half is from Cornwall, there are still meaderies down there. You go and get a chicken in a basket and you get a glass of, or rather a kind of stone tankard of mead to go with it. So it has this kind of medieval, oldie worldy kind of association, I suppose. And it's a relatively straightforward way to make alcohol. You're effectively using the sugar in the honey to convert that into booze. What I do is convert sugar that I derive from grain and turn that into booze, which is a much more long-winded and slightly more painful process, but it's a little bit easier than harvesting 40 or 50 kilos of honey once or twice a year and then trying to use that to make booze. So a braggot is, I guess, probably originally came about as a result of practicality, not having enough sugar or enough honey in order to make sufficient beer from or mead from it. So using grain in order to supplement that to create additional sugars to extend the volume of booze you're able to make, I suppose. I'm speculating wildly here, but that would make sense to me. A lot of brewing history seems to stem from practicalities, so it would make sense to me that that's the case. When Richard and John approached us to ask whether we'd be interested in making a beer with honey, I was aware of what they'd done at Red Willow and what they'd done at Blackjack. We actually launched the Blackjack version here as part of Manchester Beer Week. We did a kind of local food producers meet local brewers kind of event, which was a lot of fun. But the honey beer was produced as part was launched at that event. And I have to confess, when they first came to me, my first response, I think, was something along the lines of, what a lovely idea, but I've very rarely had a honey beer that I've drunk that I particularly like or is particularly memorable. Which I felt a bit bad about saying, but it's absolutely true. A lot of the best honey-based beers that I've tried, or beers that contain honey, are often very traditional cask ales. Which basically are primed with that honey and allowed to go through a conditioning phase in the cask before they're poured. And as a result, a lot of that honey flavour comes out in the beer. If you're going to put honey in a beer, it's a valuable commodity. It's something which takes a lot of time and effort for the bees to make and for beekeepers to extract. To just chuck some in for the kind of sugar value, which gives the beer a little bit more strength, seemed a bit of a waste of time to me. We don't make cask beer here, so trying to do a kind of 3.5% sessionable bitter with a nice little honey twang wasn't really an option for us. So my proposal back to them, I think, was a little shocking at the time, which was, well, how about a 9% braggot? To which both of them, in fairness, were kind of receptive, but you put an awful lot of faith in us to be able to produce that. It's not something we'd ever done before. We're not an enormously experimental brewery. What we tend to do is brew things that we like. But we are getting to a stage, we've been going about 4 years, getting to a stage where we are building our knowledge base to a point where we're able to experiment a little bit more readily, I suppose. So we thought we'd give it a go. And having talked about the Irk Valley and the history of, that's the River Irk at the back, it's not a dirty canal, it is indeed the River Irk. This area was incredibly industrial at one point in time. Some of that is still, I guess, visible as you travel up the valley, up towards Collyhurst, but not an awful lot of it. And we felt we wanted to try and bring a little bit of that kind of history into the beer as well. So whilst making something which was interesting enough and focused on the flavour of honey itself, I suppose. That, I guess, was my problem with a lot of honey beers that I tried. There was very little evidence that there was kind of honey used in its production. If you're going to use that as your prime, you're showing off the flavour, the delicateness, the kind of floral characteristics, the sweetness. It seemed to me obvious that we would want to do something which actually tasted of honey to a point. Now that sounds a bit obvious, but often during fermentation, honey is gobbled up by the yeast, basically, and there is potentially very little evidence of the honey left in the final product. It may as well almost be substituted for cane sugar or something being chucked in. So that was why really we wanted to try and do something which was a bit more extreme and a bit more unusual, but something which actually puts honey at the front of up front and centre in terms of what this drink was going to taste like. As I say, the heritage of this area, we wanted to try and bring a little bit of that into the equation. So we came up with the idea of using smoked malt. In this case, I mean, smoked malt is often imported in from Germany, where they brew a lot of smoked beer. So we'll use what's known as Rauch malt, maple or honey basted bacon would not be a bad place to start for a beverage. But we decided we wanted something a little bit less weird than that. Bearing in mind we were doing something weird enough in the first place, I suppose. So we actually used malt which was smoked over rum and bourbon barrels. So barrels that had stored rum and bourbon. Once they're finished with their not used again for that purpose, they're either sent up to distilleries in Scotland and used to age whiskey, or they're sold to people like us to put beer into. In this case, they were bought and used as the base fuel for effectively smoking the malt that we used, a proportion of the malt that we used to make the beer. So some of that sweetness comes from the honey, some of the sweetness you're tasting comes from the rum and bourbon casks that were used to smoke the malt. The smokiness is relatively subtle, that's deliberate. We didn't want it to overtake the flavour of the honey, but it adds a little sweetness and a bit of extra character to it, I suppose. And I guess in the romantic, you've probably worked out already, Richard is an enormous romantic kind of guy. There was a romantic sense that it was kind of evoked the kind of industrial heritage of the area within which it was brewed, I suppose, that kind of smokiness. That was their kind of idea, I suppose. It was a nice thing to experiment with and to try and add. And we thought it would go well with the flavour of the honey too, I suppose. The final ingredient, which was, I guess, a little bit weird and wonderful, was the yeast. Yeast is what converts sugar to alcohol, and it's regularly thought of as a very functional ingredient in beer, not something which necessarily adds character or flavour or aroma. But in this case, we sought out a yeast from one of our yeast suppliers who was incredibly helpful, actually, Rob from Lallemond, who has a bank of very, very experimental yeasts that he kind of encourages idiots to use occasionally to see whether they can use it to turn it into something alcoholic or not. And this was the yeast that we chose was actually a hybrid yeast. When I say a hybrid yeast, what I mean by that is something which has been propagated for use to make wine, but also to make beer, which seemed to me to be very apt for a braggot, which is half beer, half honey wine, if you like, which is what mead kind of is. As it happened, the one that you had available was Belgian in origin, which means you also get a little bit of that kind of extra Belgian kind of floral, kind of like a wit, something like that, a Belgian wit. Adds some of those kind of flavours to the drink as well. So 50% honey, 50% the sugar, 50% from honey, 50% from malt. We used a small amount of hops because we didn't want it to end up too bitter. Honey is not bitter. So why make this incredibly bitter? We use enough to hopefully create some level of balance. This hybrid yeast, which is sometimes used for wine, sometimes used for beer, brought those two things together, and then this kind of funny smoky malt. And the result is what's in front of you. It's something which, from our perspective, was a very experimental thing to try and make. No mean feat in many ways to end up with something which I'm actually very pleased with. It's got a bit of dessert wine kind of going on there. Lots of fruitiness, a little bit of, some people I've heard be talking about sort of almost strawberry aromas and things like that. So there's a bit of summer fruit in there. But hopefully some of that smokiness brings that back down to something which is a little bit more, not too sweet and fruity, something that has a level of balance to it as well. Do try it with some of the cheese. I think it goes really well with that as well. And I guess the only other thing to say from my perspective is thank you to all the beekeepers that Brew work with, who provided us with an array of honey. I've never had a honey tasting in my life. Well, when Richard turned up with, I don't know, 12, 13 different sources of honey from across the Manchester region, we sat down and he made me try every single one at a time. And I'll tell you what, the variation was incredible. Far greater than I imagined it would be. And from talking to Jack and Richard, learning a little bit more about where those bees pollinate, what they're feeding on, has an enormous effect potentially on the flavour of the honeys as well. So trying to bring a little bit of that complexity out in the final beer was something which gave us even more reason to kind of spend more time and more effort to try and get it right, to try and research every element of the process to make sure we did it justice, I suppose. I know the guys are really pleased with the outcome. I'm really pleased with the outcome because it is something which I think showcases the honey that we were brought on the day. And it's something which we may never do again. Not because we don't like it, but because it was an enormously expensive thing to do. We only brewed about half of the volume we normally would, because trying to get 60 kilos of honey into the building was, 60 kilos of honey is a lot of honey. I think we ended up with about 30 kilos, which, was an awful lot to try and incorporate into the beer. So trying to do this at a big scale is almost impossible, I guess. I would love to do it again at some point, but it's one of those beers which is a one-off. It is a little bit of a special thing for us to have done. So thank you very much for asking us to get involved, and thank you all for coming as well. As I say, it's a little bit of a special occasion for us in that respect. So we really appreciate you coming down. Do let us know what you think, and as I say, thanks for coming. Cheers.